Okay, so for this class, we're going to be talking about the idea of rights. Normally, when we talk about rights, we're talking about the idea of civil rights, or at least that's what most people sort of associate the idea with. But in this class, we're also going to explore the idea of political rights and social rights as well. So the readings for this class reflect that distinction as well, particularly in the writings by Thomas Marshall, basically separates rights into those three different um, categories. Michael Mann and Charles Tilly also sort of build upon this idea, but they kind of sort of expand the framework a little bit more to encompass different countries and different sort of pathways to rights. Marshall basically covers one example, so the evolution of rights in England, but we're going to sort of take his idea of civil, political, and social rights and sort of look at it in regards to the United States. And we probably won't get that much time to talk about Mann or Tilly's essay either, but again, as usual, I encourage people to read it. So, what are rights basically? I mean, if we understand them at least in the terms of human rights, which sort of you could argue broadly encompasses all the categories of rights. Human rights, as it says here, can be understood as defining those basic standards which are necessary for a life of dignity, and their universality is derived from the fact that in this respect, at least all humans are equal. We should not and cannot discriminate between them. So rights are essential for a life of dignity. They are universal, meaning that all people are entitled to them. Again, pretty common sense stuff. I think most people understand that part already. Of course, what exactly constitutes a life of dignity, I would say, is more of an issue for a debate. Particularly again when we turn to the idea of social rights, which are much more limited here in the United States than they are in most other countries. So again, according to Marshall, there are three kinds of rights and three kinds of citizenship, which correspond with that: civil, political, and social. According to Marshall, the development of rights is a long process. So for Marshall, civil rights first originate in England roughly around the 17th century or so. And then over the course of centuries, you see the gradual expansion of political rights, granting the right to vote, particularly to working class people. And then from out of that, the development of social rights as well. Basically, when working class people gain the right to vote, they then use that voting power to then fight for social rights, healthcare, education, things like that. So for Marshall, this follows a fairly linear progression, at least in the case of England. Again, as Mann and Tilly show, that linear process doesn't always play out. In the United States, it follows somewhat of a different progression. Not so interested in the historical evolution of rights, but really just to properly delineate different kind of species of rights, beginning, of course, with civil rights. And then we can segue into talking about why social rights are much more controversial here, even though working class people do have the right to vote. So again, according to Marshall, civil rights are necessary for individual freedom. These include things like individual liberty, freedom of speech, thought, and faith, the right to own property, and to conclude valid contracts, and the right to justice. This last right is different because it presumes the ability to defend your rights on equal terms and under due process of law. Civil rights are closely tied to institutions like the courts and the legal system. In the US, they are mostly found in the Bill of Rights and additional amendments to the Constitution. Now, Marshall argues here that civil rights, as he says, were also indispensable to a competitive market economy. They gave to each man, as part of his independent status, the power to engage as an independent unit in the economic struggle, and made it possible to deny him social protection on the ground that he was equipped with the means to protect himself. So in some ways, civil rights are almost kind of like a double-edged sword. He's saying that basically what he's saying is that civil rights are essential for the development of capitalism, which of course is true. The right to own property, private ownership of property are absolutely essential for the growth of capitalism, at least during this phase. Civil rights can also be used as a way to sort of deny people additional economic protections, as Marshall says. The idea being that, well, if a person has civil rights, they're essentially equipped with all they need to get by, and so any other sort of legal protections are then unnecessary and excessive in many ways. So it's important, thing to understand. We tend to talk about civil rights in a very sort of hallowed way, a very the high degree of reverence originating, of course, from the civil rights movement, and of course they are absolutely essential. But Marshall tends to define civil rights, in a very kind of like a minimal way, right? Civil rights in many ways are sort of like the most sort of like minimal extension of the idea of rights, of universal um, um, protections for people, and actually kind of leave a lot of things out. And again, like I said, are also very much closely tied to the development of a capitalist system as well. So we've already covered things like the First Amendment. I don't see any need to go through it here. Other important civil rights, the idea of due process of law, which we see increasingly being challenged now under the current Trump um, administration. Crucially, this idea that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Later classes, what we'll talk more about the difference between a procedural due process and substantive due process. But the basic idea, the most basic understanding of this idea of procedural due process is that, yes, before the government can deprive a person of their rights, there has to be some sort of clearly defined legal process that the government is following here. This will be very important later on when we talk about ideas like a right to housing and rent control, things like that. But like I said, we'll also return to this idea when we talk about the Supreme Court more. You see the 14th Amendment expands upon this idea, now expanding the idea of due process to the states as well, not just to the federal government. Okay, so pretty quickly, again, we've to some extent talked about civil rights already, and I think most people kind of have a pretty good understanding of that. But the next sort of category of rights are political rights. And I would imagine most people probably tend to conflate civil and political rights together for the most part. But in theory, they can be considered to be separate things. So political rights, the way in which Marshall defines it, is the right to participate in the exercise of political power. It means holding office or even simply just voting, the right to vote, essentially. Civil rights without political power to back it up are very insecure, meaning without a proper foundation of political power, without the ability to hold leaders accountable in some ways, civil rights are very insecure. What's to prevent a government from taking away your civil rights if you have no political power, basically, to back it up? So Marshall writes, the political rights of citizenship, unlike the civil rights, were full of potential danger to the capitalist system. Although those who were cautiously extending them down to the social scale probably did not realize how great the danger was. They could hardly be expected to foresee what vast changes could be brought about by the peaceful use of political power without a violent and bloody revolution. Now, this to this very day divides many socialist activists and scholars. Is it possible to achieve socialism without a so-called violent and bloody revolution? Many people would argue no, and that seems to be the dominant path in which socialism, as we understand it, has taken shape over the last century and a half or so. But it seems quite clear that if you look back to Marx and Engels, for example, they apparently believed at least in the potential for socialism to sort of come about without a so-called violent and bloody revolution, but could be accomplished through electoral means, provided these countries had already sort of advanced through the so-called capitalist stage of development or mode of production, as Marx called it, and assuming, of course, that workers did, of course, have the right to vote. We also see the importance of political rights in the United States as well, particularly in the abolition movement and in the early Reconstruction period, and then, of course, continuing on into the civil rights movement as well. Abolitionist leaders like Frederick Douglass, for example, believed that political rights were absolutely essential for protecting, again, the civil rights of the former slaves. So Douglass writes, I am for the immediate, unconditional, and universal enfranchisement of the black man in every state in the Union. Without this, his liberty is a mockery. Without this, you might as well almost retain the old name of slavery for his condition. For in fact, if he is not the slave of the individual master, he is the slave of society and holds his liberty as a privilege, not as a right. He is at the mercy of the mob and has no means of protecting himself. And of course, the eventual extension of political rights to former slaves was important during Reconstruction. And then the removal, the taking back of these political rights was also absolutely, essential in establishing the Jim Crow segregation that took shape after Reconstruction. Du Bois writes of Thaddeus Stevens, the leader of the radical Republicans during and after the Civil War. He writes, from the first, Stevens knew that beneath all theoretical freedom and political right must lie the economic foundation. So here we see this idea that Marshall advances, that civil rights are sort of the most sort of basic, minimal idea of rights. And then from that, you get political rights, the way in which to hold your civil rights secure. But beyond even that, once political rights have been attained, you need economic security to make those secure as well. So all these kind of concepts of rights are sort of building upon each other, and all of which to some extent depend upon each other as well. You really can't have one essentially without having all three. Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio declared, this is Du Bois going on to write, declared in public meetings that after the abolition of slavery, a radical change in the relations of capital and of property in land is next upon the order of the day. And Du Bois, investigates this to very comprehensive degree in his book Black Reconstruction in America, which is an important book that people should read. Du Bois sees Reconstruction as basically almost a Marxist experiment in creating socialism in the South. The most significant experiment in Marxism, he argues, before the Russian Revolution in 1917. Going back to Marshall's argument here, again, Marshall is, talking in an English context. But we can see that throughout the 19th century in England, in the United Kingdom, voting rights were very restricted for men and for women, and regardless of skin color as well. The defining characteristic here is basically property ownership. You have to own a certain amount of property to be able to vote. You can see well into the end of the 19th century, a significant, at least a third of the population or more was still excluded from having the right to vote. In the United States, you also early on, besides the gender and racial exclusions of voting, which I think are fairly well known, you also early on had property restrictions on voting as well. Although in the United States, those tended to fall away at a much earlier point in time, basically about around the 1820s or so. Pretty much most of those property restrictions had been removed, basically, although of course obvious other obstacles to voting still remain. But again, in other countries, particularly like in the United Kingdom here, these property restrictions on voting, continued well into the 20th century, in fact. You see, it wasn't until 1929 that all men and all women could vote. 1929, almost, a decade after women even gained the right to vote in the United States, which of course was, considered almost an embarrassment that the U.S., did not grant women the right to vote. The United Kingdom was even worse in that regard. So, to what extent are political rights secure today in the United States? Well, not very. I mean, one thing that people often point out is that, we don't even really have a clearly defined right to vote in the Constitution. You would think that would be among the most important things, but actually it isn't. Voting rights, for the most part, as the Constitution says, are basically left up to the states. And we've seen, particularly over the last decade or so, significant efforts to restrict the right to vote in the United States. So as this graphic shows you here, these are states that basically passed what they call voter restriction law, or what is generally referred to as voter restriction laws or voter suppression laws in various states. And again, going back to our lecture on federalism, you can see that, these are many of the same states. They usually find lumped in with the lowest healthcare rankings, the lowest education rankings. The states have banned abortion and things like that. These states generally tend to overlap in those areas. These are the more conservative states in many ways. And you can see they're quite extensive as well. Although this idea of voter suppression has long been a problem in the United States, it's become much more significant over the last 10 or 15 years. Alongside that, you also see state felon voting laws. Now, these are not often as talked about, but these are states that, as you can see highlighted here in the different colors, states that basically restrict or take away the right to vote based upon a person's incarceration. If a person has been convicted of a crime while they're in prison in many cases, and in many instances, even after prison, they're on parole or probation, lose the right to vote, sometimes for a very long period of time. Some states, as you can see here, the ones highlighted in orange, you could basically lose the right to vote permanently. So if you've ever been convicted of a crime, can lose the right to vote there. And again, once again, you see many of the same states highlighted here. So these things, combined, create significant obstacles to the right to vote, particularly for lower income people. Now, these topics have been, this is nothing new. Like I said, since 2010, these topics have already been covered, for example, in books written by Frances Fox Piven and Richard Clower, Why Americans Don't Vote, published in the 1980s. And then the follow-up to it, Why Americans Still Don't Vote. We'll encounter Piven and Clower later on in the class as well. But they highlight many of the, and again, this is pre-2010. So if anything, this has become much worse since 2010. But they highlight many of the, obstacles to voting in the United States. So here are some of them right here. Restrictive voter registration laws. Many states require voters to register weeks before Election Day, a process that disproportionately affects low-income individuals who may face challenges in accessing registration opportunities or keeping track of deadlines. Limited access to polling places. Poor communities often experience fewer polling stations, leading to long lines and significant wait times, which discourage participation, especially among those who cannot afford to take time off work. Voter ID requirements. Strict voter ID laws can be a barrier for low-income individuals who may lack necessary documentation or the means to obtain it. And again, these things have become even worse, arguably, since over the last 10, 15 years. Election day, scheduling, holding elections on a weekday rather than a weekend, or designating it as a federal holiday creates difficulties for working class voters who cannot easily take time off. Purging of voter rolls. Practices like voter roll purges often disproportionately affect transient populations, which again include many low-income individuals. Disenfranchisement laws. Felony disenfranchisement laws prevent millions disproportionately from lower income and minority communities from voting. Lack of outreach and mobilization. Political campaigns often target wealthier and more reliable voters, neglecting outreach to poor and working class communities. Complex ballot processes, complicated voting procedures, or poorly designed ballots can deter participation among individuals with less formal education or limited experience navigating bureaucratic systems. And these are just some of the things that they highlight. Now, some of these things, sound pretty significant even on face value, like purging voter rolls, disenfranchisement laws. Some of them might sound more, annoyances than anything else, depending upon your point of view. But you have to look at it as a total package, right? Combined, these things create actually very significant obstacles, which again disproportionately affect lower income individuals and minorities from voting. As a result, you have very low voter turnout among those groups. This, of course, so any potential power that working class voters might have to use the political process to change things is, of course, significantly undermined by this. That's why for many people, many people, of course, would be very, cynical of this idea. Really, voting is going to bring about revolutionary change. Really, Marx and Engels actually believe things like that. Well, here we have a country where there are no, significant obstacles, legal obstacles at least to voting, at least not on the surface. And yet we see how politics, proceeds in this country. So that obviously leads to, a cynical attitude in many aspects. The counter argument to that is, well, you can't really just take things as they are. You have to recognize that there are, in fact, significant obstacles, even to this very day, that make it harder for lower income individuals to vote, which significantly, again, undermines their political power. The sort of, potential power that could exist there is never actualized, basically, because of this. Now let's look at a couple of factoids about this. So U.S. voter turnout in context. U.S. ranks 26 out of 32 OECD countries. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. In voter turnout. In recent presidential elections, only roughly about 60% of eligible voters participated. This is in the 2016 election. Midterm elections typically see around 40% turnout, though 2018 was an exception, a little bit higher, around 50%. Income and voting. Higher income equals higher voter turnout. In 2016, only 48% of the lowest income families voted versus 86% of the highest income families. So almost all higher income people and higher income individuals vote, whereas basically about less than half of low income people vote in elections. A significant disparity between the two. This income voting gap persists across election years. So low income people don't vote. Now, it's often said that the reason why low income people don't vote is because, they're lazy and they don't care and things like that. Well, in light of what, Piven and Cloward and many other people have outlined here, that's not necessarily the case. That in fact there are major structural obstacles that make it harder for lower income people to vote as well. Here's a report from the Poor People's Campaign in 2021. The 2020 presidential elections had the highest voter turnout in U.S. History. I don't know if that's entirely true, but okay, including among poor and low income voters. Of 168 million voters, they're probably going based upon the number of people that voted, not the percentage of the population. Elections in the 19th century, from what I've read, would routinely have 80% voter turnout and things like that. I think the 2020 election had around a 2/3 voter turnout, which is high by American standards, but not significantly high compared to other countries, or even historically compared to the United States. But anyway, of 168 million voters, 58 million, about 35%, were low-income voters, which they argue counters the myth that poor low-income people are politically apathetic or insignificant. Now, again, the fact that only 35% of them voted, or of the votes that were cast, only about 35% of them were low-income voters, is still significantly low. It's still below, the population share, according to the Poor People's Campaign, of low-income voters is roughly about 40% of the population. So still, below their overall population share. I think if low-income voters voted at about the same rate as higher income voters did, they probably would have made about, higher than that. I mean, 40% of voters being low income is probably low. Probably maybe as much as 45% to 40, even 50% of those cast could have been considered low income voters. Depending upon where you define that low income threshold, whether you make it 40% or a little bit higher. I would argue probably making it higher. Low-income voters made up of over 20% of voters in 45 states, plus DC. In battleground states with narrow margins, low-income voters accounted for about 35% to 45% of voters. And you can see here they list several states where low-income voters made up a significant portion of the vote here. But again, they're framing 35% is fairly high. So obviously in previous elections, it would have been uh, lower, of the overall votes cast in the election. So, it's still a significant obstacle that needs to be overcome. Low income people do not vote. Again, this will be something that we'll touch on again when we talk about things like housing in the United States. But let's now turn to the idea of social rights. These are probably the most controversial category of rights here in the United States. These include things like healthcare, education. According to Marshall, social rights were created by granting political power to the working class. He writes, but the normal method of establishing social rights is by the exercise of political power. For social rights imply an absolute right to a certain standard of civilization, which is conditional only on the discharge of the general duties of citizenship. Their content does not depend on the economic value of the individual claimant. So social rights cannot be understood without first sort of granting political power to the working class, who then use that political power to fight for these things. But social rights, in theory, would be rights that are necessary for people to live a dignified life, or as Marshall says here, a standard of civilization. And I think that's an important question to ask. I mean, because we tend to exclude these things in this country as being rights. That healthcare and education, housing are not rights. I mean, can you really have a dignified life though without those things? I don't see how you really could. And therefore, logically speaking, I mean, these things are essential and therefore should basically be considered rights that people are entitled to. And they are recognized throughout most other countries in the world. Not in the United States, though. They are to some extent codified by the United Nations, although the United States has not signed on, or ratified, for example, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It was actually signed by President Jimmy Carter, but was not ratified by the Senate. The greatest extension of social rights in the U.S. occurred basically between the 1930s and 1970s, as limited as they are. What we have basically pretty much all occurred during that period of time. I mean, since the 1970s, there's basically been no real extension of social rights. And if anything, what social rights existed have basically been rolled back and continue to be to this very day, as we see with things like Trump's massive cuts to Medicaid. Many colleges in the U.S., public colleges in the U.S., like City College and basically all the CUNY schools, were tuition free until the late 1970s. I love bringing that up for people who probably struggle to pay their tuition. Why was it that they were able to maintain these tuition free schools in some cases for over 100 years? I mean, City College goes back to the 1840s. So for over 100 years, almost 150 years, there was a tuition free school. Why were they able to maintain a system like that for so long, but are unable to do so today? So we've already talked about healthcare to some extent, so I'm not going to actually have too much to say about it here. One thing to keep in mind, of course, is that United Healthcare, whose CEO was shot several months ago, of course, has the highest rate of denial among any health insurance corporation. And this really gets to the heart of the issue, too, is that in the United States, because healthcare, education, and housing are not treated as social rights, what are they? They're basically commodities, right? They are treated as a means of making a profit. So in many regards, you could argue that the point of social rights is to, as some people would argue, decommodify healthcare, housing, etc. So according to Espen Andersen, decommodification refers to the extent to which individuals and families can maintain a normal and socially acceptable standard of living, regardless of market performance. The opposite, commodification, is the process of transforming inalienable, free, or gifted things, objects, services, ideas, nature, personal information, people, or animals into commodities or objects for sale. So in the United States, things like healthcare and housing are commodities. They are treated as objects to be sold, basically, rather than basic human rights. And this notion of examining the commodity form, of course, comes right out of Marx, right? This is literally, Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 1. But it shows you how important these concepts are in understanding, current day social problems that go on. Um, Now, I also think it's important to understand that what people are talking about here is a fairly limited argument, right? I mean, Marx's idea, of course, is much more radical. Marx is essentially saying that we should de-commodify everything, in fact. Um, and that might be a good idea. But I think if we can kind of bracket that out for a second, we'll leave that more revolutionary argument alone here, because I think people often try to frame ideas like healthcare as a human right and things like that. That's a very kind of radical argument. It's actually very not. I mean, if you take a step back from the idea that we should decommodify everything and just focus on key aspects like healthcare, housing, etc., it's a very kind of moderate argument, because essentially what you were saying here is that, okay, we'll essentially leave the private consumption economy alone. You still go out and buy your shoes and things like that, but there are certain things that are so important that they should not be treated as commodities. Now, to me, that seems like I said, a very kind of moderate argument, actually, and again, one which is sort of taken for granted almost in most other countries besides the United States. And what are the consequences of this commodification? So, in the United States, people waste 92 billion pounds of food annually, equal to 145 billion meals. They throw away over 473 billion worth of food annually. Shockingly, they waste 30% of all the food in America. So because food, of course, is treated as a commodity in this country, it leads to extreme inefficiencies in how we feed people. You know, there are, many hungry people just in the United States, let alone in the world, and many more people that are considered food insecure. Yeah, maybe they have a meal one day, but their ability to get access to food is very insecure. But why are people having such a hard time eating? It's not because there's a lack of food available. Our ability to produce food far exceeds, given the amount of waste that is produced, the needs of people to actually eat. The problem isn't that there's not enough food to feed people. It's because people don't have money, basically. And so you have this, horrible contradiction of, billions of pounds of food being wasted while you still have probably millions of people in this country that do not have good access to food. And of course, this is, magnified, substantially when you're talking about it at a global level. Housing too. We always hear about the housing shortage in this country. But according to this article here, more than 60,000 rent stabilized apartments are now vacant. And tenant advocates say landlords are holding them for ransom. We're going to take a closer look at that in a moment. But finally, so we've talked about food, we've talked about housing, now talking about healthcare, and we'll talk about education too in a moment. According to a Yale study, Medicare for all would save U.S. $450 billion a year, usually mostly in administrative costs. But more importantly, prevent nearly 70,000 deaths a year. That's every year. So think what the opposite is, right? The lack of Medicare for all is basically causing the deaths of 70,000 people a year. And I've seen other reports that make that somewhat of a conservative estimate as well. Many people would say, probably hundreds of thousands of people die every year because of lack of access to healthcare. So let's take a look at housing for a second. First of all, I mean, home prices continue to go through the roof. Basically, they're far higher than they were in the highly speculative housing market leading up to 2007, 2008. Even calling it a housing market already, presumes this idea of commodified housing, right? I mean, if housing was not a commodity, we would not be talking about it as a market. So I'm aware of that. When you say that, you're conceding that essentially. But if you're explicit about it, you make people aware of the fact that, well, this is not necessarily the way things are or should be, but this is the way things are, is what I meant to say. You also then have to question the idea of, well, to what extent should landlords be allowed to make a profit from housing? If housing is a basic human right, why do we let it be commodified, but why do we let people make enormous profits, essentially providing something which should be considered a basic human right. And along with this, there have been some attempts, of course, to restrict the power of landlords to charge whatever rent they wanted to through various rent control laws, of which New York City kind of pioneered the idea in many ways. Well, you have to also, distinguish between rent control and rent stabilization. Rent control is more or less, capping rents at a certain level. Stabilization, which is really what New York City has now, is more about, allowing for increases in rent, but at a more sort of moderated pace. That's more thing to keep in mind, because people often talk about rent control in New York City, but for the most part, you don't really have rent control. You have rent stabilization, which is kind of a watered down idea. Now, obviously housing, or I should say in an American politics class like this, normally we focus on national issues. But I think for the purposes of discussion, we can for a little while confine ourselves to talking about housing in New York City, since it is so emblematic of these issues in the country as a whole. Anyway, many people would argue that rent control laws are unconstitutional. We'll see this claim made at several points. That's just basically a bold-faced lie. What they're basically saying is that rent control laws violate the idea of due process of law. There is no constitutional right to be a landlord, obviously. So what they're saying is that rent control or rent stabilization is basically a violation of the idea of due process of law, that you're depriving somebody of the right to dispense with their property as they see fit. However, again, the Constitution doesn't say that landlords have a right to charge whatever amount they want for rent. It just says that you cannot be deprived, or in this case, your property be regulated without due process of law. So the question is, do rent control laws or rent stabilization laws meet the standard of due process of law? And the answer is, of course they do. They've been passed by political legislatures. They've been tried in court numerous times. This here is just a partial list of attempts to challenge rent control laws that have made it up to the Supreme Court. And in all instances here, the Supreme Court, which normally is very friendly to business interests and economic interest, elite economic interest, has upheld the constitutionality of rent control laws. So they've been passed by legislatures. They've been defended in courts. These are just some of the Supreme Court cases. It doesn't even count cases that have challenged rent control at lower level courts. So the idea that rent control laws are just this arbitrary assertion of power is just complete nonsense, basically. They have been, again, codified in laws and defended in court multiple times. Again, in institutions that usually tend to be very favorable to big business interests. And again, even in spite of that, rents continue to go up. So this is a report from the New York City Rental Guidelines Board, the sort of housing authority which oversees rent increases in the city. And you can see rents continue to go up. 3% increase in 1-year leases, 4.5% increase in 2-year leases. And these are for rents that are already very high to begin with as well. So what I want to do here now is actually switch over to my web browser for a moment. This is data from apartments.com. What is the average rent in New York? So the average rent, so keep in mind when we're talking about these 3%, 4.5% increases, what is that percentage increase being applied to? The average rent in New York is already over $4,000 a month for a fairly small apartment, right? And that already represents a 2.7 increase from the last year. So the current increases are even higher. As it says here, as of July 2025, the average rent in New York is, again, a little over $4,000 per month. That is 146% higher than the national average rent price of about $1,600 a month. It's more than twice, double the amount higher, making New York one of the most expensive cities in the U.S. This is the issue too. Even people who are now talking about rent control, or Mamdani, for example, who wants to freeze rents. Well, okay, you can freeze rents, possibly. But what will bringing those rents down? Even if you freeze them, you're leaving them at their at their existing level, I mean, they're still too high to begin with anyway. So you have to do more than just freeze the rents. You actually have to bring these rents down a little bit to make it affordable for people. By the way, the reason why the Supreme Court has ruled rent control laws are constitutional is because they serve a legitimate public interest. Again, we'll talk about this more when we talk about the idea of substantive due process. But of course, people need a place to live. People need housing, and to unfairly restrict the supply of housing to people violates that public interest. Therefore, there is a need to, yes, regulate the cost of housing. It's a far cry from fully decommodifying, housing, which would completely, again, remove housing as a commodity for sale, basically, completely remove the profit motive as a decisive factor here. But it is like, many liberal reforms in this country, sort of a halfway response to dealing with a fairly significant problem. Um, and you can see, as a that's basically based on a one-bedroom apartment. You can see the breakdown here for different types of apartments. Again, fairly small as well. Now, averages can sometimes be misleading, right? Because very high levels at the top can distort that average. But here you get more of a breakdown here. Over 84% of apartments in New York rent for over $2,000 a month, still higher than the national average. So that's significantly high. For many people, that's going to be anywhere between 30 to 50% of your income, which is a significant amount, and that's just for the cost of housing. Okay, now what is this idea of warehousing apartments? What these landlords are trying to do basically is to, since we are living in a housing market, since we are forced to operate according to the rules of a housing market, what they are trying to do is to basically manipulate the laws of supply and demand. By artificially restricting the supply of housing, they're hoping to increase the price of it. They are trying to sort of overwhelm or override the regulations that stabilize rents at certain levels and sort of force those things to go up more, because they're just trying to make a profit, basically. So I have this article here. It's very similar to the other, or no, I included this article among the course readings for this class. It's not required reading, but I would say recommended reading, mostly for the comments section, which I hope we can have a little bit fun with it right here, because this comment section is pretty wild, actually. I mean, what you have are landlords and tenants basically arguing with each other here. 30 comments for an article like this is probably a lot. I'm not going to go through, obviously, every single one, but you can see certain things that stand out here. So this person is, again, quoting the article. So what the article is basically arguing for is to tax landlords that warehouse their apartments, which this person claims, along with others, any restrictions on landlords are of doubtful constitutionality. So you see this claim made again and again and again. Again, repeating the completely false statement that rent control or rent stabilization is unconstitutional, when it's just not. I mean, these laws have been challenged but in the courts multiple times and have been upheld. So what about that makes it unconstitutional? This woman writes, this is pure tenant propaganda, right? Tenants who are, mostly living paycheck to paycheck have all this money to throw around to finance a propaganda machine like the Heritage Foundation or something like that. I mean, again, most of these comments are just kind of absurd. That's why I'm saying you can have a little bit of fun with it. I realize if you haven't actually read it prior to this, it may not stick out that way. That's why I'm trying to focus on a few of the key points here. This woman complained. This is one of the tenants then, complaining about how shitty the apartments are in New York City. They're old and rusty and filled with bugs and roaches and mice and things like that. And she kind of goes on a little bit. This person, yes, once again, forced against the constitutional rights to provide the subsidy known as rent stabilize and rent control. So again, once again, repeating this false narrative that rent control is unconstitutional doesn't even distinguish between rent control and rent stabilization, which again, rent stabilization is even more sort of watered down idea than the idea of rent control, which again, as we've already said, basically even that leaves in place the idea of a, you know, a commodified housing market. And this guy is very, condescending for the most part. Basically, tells her, "Oh, well, you don't know if that's mold." I mean, basically just gaslighting this lady the whole time. A lot of these comments I notice are basically landlords complaining that they can't make a profit off of housing, which is probably not true, given New York City rents. Um, but if there is any truth to that at all, well, my response to them would be, well, don't be a landlord then. If this line of business is not lucrative for you, do something else. Where does it say that you have to be a landlord? I mean, most people, or many people at least, think landlords are like social parasites. Basically, they just exist to profit off of the you know monopoly that they have over housing, and the lack of for the most part public housing alternatives, that they don't provide any kind of socially beneficial service or anything like that. Some of them even talk about themselves this way, as if they're performing some sort of community service by being a landlord. I mean, you're completely full of shit. You're just trying to make money off of something which basically should be considered a human right. And unfortunately, most of the tenants here, the people who are writing in response to the landlords, who I assume are tenants, fortunately, none of them bring that up. Not one person brings up the idea that housing is a social right. The idea that a commodified housing market is sort of goes against what should be considered a basic human right for all. So unfortunately, perhaps if some of these tenants were sort of equipped with that kind of understanding, maybe they could push back even a little bit more. Anyway, this person calls the other person out for not addressing their points. This lady keeps chiming in saying Democrats don't care whether something is constitutional or not, because we all know that the Democrats just completely throw the Constitution overboard and don't care about the institutions or processes of the American government at all, which is obviously clearly not true. If anything, they care too much about it and are too willing to sacrifice the public good for the integrity of these institutions which they serve, whereas the Republicans, of course, are quite willing to throw any kind of constitutional process overboard the moment it conflicts with their interests. Let's see. The article quotes about 92,000 homeless in New York. This guy chimes in saying it's more about 150,000. I believe like nationwide, there's close to about 800,000 homeless people in the United States, and even that might be considered a conservative estimate. This person says that in a building of 127 units, almost half the building is empty, because people can't afford it. This lady again chimes in, Democrats don't care whether it's constitutional or not. Again, I mean, you can really see that most of them really don't have any argument at all. And you kind of come away from this thing thinking, well, like, thank God there's at least some kind of restriction here, because I mean, who wants to give these people more power than what they already have? I mean, most of them are just unscrupulous liars for the most part. They're just completely making up shit. They don't have any real argument. They don't care about their tenants. They're completely deaf to any of the complaints being raised by tenants here. And again, they're essentially trying to profit from something which should be considered basically a human right. To which I say, well, do something else. Open a sandwich shop. Open a pizzeria or something like that. Do something else. Why do you insist upon making a profit as a landlord? And many of them probably do anyway. And for anyone that probably thinks is thinking, well, there's too many pizzerias already, it won't work. I don't really care what they do. I care about I care as much for them as they probably care about their tenants anyway. So this guy, rational logic. There's a couple of people like here that probably are libertarians and like to chime in and try to show how smart they are. This guy claims that NYC Rent Guidelines Board estimates that unit maintenance costs are almost $1,100 a month. Why should landlords be forced to rent apartments for less than it costs to maintain them? Now, first of all, does it really cost $1,100 every month just in maintenance? I mean, what kind of repairs are going on in these places? Um, Most landlords don't do anything as far as I can see. And when you do have an issue, in my experience at least, I have to fight like hell to get my landlord to do anything, even to the point of threatening to withhold rent on more than one occasion because they just don't fix things for months and months at a time. So 1,100 to me sounds a bit high, even if that's true. Again, as we just saw, 84% of apartments in New York City rent for over $2,000 a month. So it's more than double what he's claiming. I'm assuming it's a he. It costs to maintain these apartments. So what are they talking about? What landlords are being forced to rent apartments for less than the cost to maintain them? The 16% that are basically renting for less than $2,000 a month. That's a very small amount. And again, that's even assuming that this number is accurate, which I think is fairly suspicious to say the least. And then they're talking about, this is logical, and yeah, but if logical statements counter the idea of giving something to people for free, then they'll just refuse to accept that. Yes, I mean, why shouldn't housing be free if it is a human right? I mean that's part of the idea of commodifying something. Yes, maybe housing should be free, but again, it literally never even occurs to these people to consider that. And unfortunately, like I said, even to the people opposing them, it never seems to occur to them either. So this is the best guy here, Voltaire, 42, very pompous. This is completely justifiable as the state dictates how much an owner can charge yet the costs continue to rise. As a landlord with rent-stabilized apartments, again, more than one, and leaving all my vacant apartments empty. So this guy is just bragging about the fact that, yeah, I'm going to basically do what I can to, artificially restrict the supply of housing in New York City so I can try to get, make more money off of it. I would love to rent them if the state let me earn a reasonable rate. What are you earning? I mean, what exactly are you doing to earn anything here? Let me earn at a reasonable rate, but I'm no way interested in essentially giving away my property rights under the socialist regulation scheme here in New York City, New York State. Now, again, until the courts rule the New York State appropriation property rights unconstitutional, don't hold your breath, because again, these things have been challenged for over 100 years now. I will simply use my vacant apartments for storage and let friends and family use them. The state will not force me to provide a service against my will at a price they dictate. So you can see there's a lot of victimization here, right? These landlords, they feel like that they're the victims, that they're the ones suffering here, not their tenants who are living in roach infested apartments paying over $2,000 a month, but they're the real victims. And this is just, I mean, complete crap. I mean, it really is. First of all, I mean, again, to return to this idea that we have socialism in New York City and state, it is a complete exaggeration. What you have are very limited reforms to somewhat regulate the privatized housing market in New York City. If you actually had socialism, again, you wouldn't have a housing market, you wouldn't have commodified housing, you wouldn't have a parasitic class of landlords like this guy basically trying to make money off of it. So when these people whine and cry about socialism, what they're really doing is basically bitching and complaining because they're only getting 90% of what they want. They can only raise their rent a few percentage points every year instead of probably 10% or more every year or something like that. But again, the rents are already high to begin with. So just complete nonsense, the usual sort of exaggerated caricature of what socialism is. New York City is a far cry from socialist housing, again, with rents, more than double the national average. And like I said, basically a commodified housing market. This guy chimes in again because we haven't heard enough from him already. And here's what else he says. It's simple economics and logic, but the Democrats in the state are just craven opportunists, given there were more renters in New York City than owners. and maybe I glossed over it, but he also talks about himself, but yeah, like providing a valuable service for people and things like that. What are you doing? You just sit on your ass and collect rent checks every month, while you're most of your tenants probably have to basically take threaten to take you to court to fix a leaky faucet or something. Um, but this idea that well the Democrats are just caving into to what the renters want. Now, in theory, if we didn't already talk about this, that might seem like a somewhat plausible argument. But we've already, discussed the idea that lower income voters vote at extremely low rates compared to high income voters. This guy probably votes. Again, I'm assuming it's a guy. This guy probably votes, but probably a lot of his tenants don't vote, at least according to the data that we've seen on voter turnout in this country. And since many renters disproportionately tend to be lower income, not all, of course, there are some people who make a lot of money who rent, but most tend to be fairly lower income. There's a good chance that a lot of their renters are not voting, and the politicians know that. The politicians know who votes, and of course they cater to who's actually going to vote, not who potentially could vote, but who actually is voting. That's another reason why this argument falls apart. And it's long been established that politicians go to the donors, the people with more money anyway. Whoever spends more money in elections still wins the vast majority of time. So the politicians know that too. So this idea that the Democrats are caving into the renters because they're more numerically have the numerical advantage here. Well, in theory, that could be true, and it does say a lot about how politics works in this country. Because yes, renters do make up the majority. So why don't they have more of a say in what's going on? Well, because they don't vote, and because the politicians go to whoever has more money. Whoever spends more money in an election campaign still wins probably about 90% of the time, or at least close to that. And the fact is, whoever, most people, believe what they read in the papers or what they see on television, and whatever candidate spends more money on ads usually tends to win the election. That's why politicians usually tend to cater to people with more money. So they're not catering towards the voters. That's a big part of the reason why you have rent is so high in the city as well. So with that being said, let's get back to this. Let's now talk about education a little bit. Especially this is one of the many things on the chopping block under the Trump administration. Now, these are some of the information here is compiled from a series of articles here. You can see I've included their titles at the bottom here. The Trump administration Education Secretary Linda McMahon are working to dismantle the U.S. public education system. Public schools, a cornerstone of democracy built over 250 years, educates tens of millions of students and are widely supported as a fundamental democratic right. Except they're not actually recognized as that by the Supreme Court. So Trump's assault on public education, massive budget cuts, proposed $12 billion cut to education, targeting the Department of Education for closure, a big push for privatization, focus on expanding charter schools, the only K-12 program receiving increased funding from 60 million to 500 million for the charter schools program, for a profit expansion. So the idea of providing funding for charter schools is both to dismantle public education, but also allows for the for-profit charter school business to, again, commodify and try to profit from education, a basic human right. This will lead to the cannibalization of public schools. Per pupil funding follows students to charters, starving traditional schools. In Detroit, 70% of charter students live in poverty versus 43% in public schools. Most charter schools pay teachers lower. Charters pay 10 to 15% less. In Michigan, for example, fewer services. Many charters lack transportation, a lunch program, or special education programs. Charter schools are also fairly well known for discriminating against students. Public schools have to take students no matter what. If you live in a certain zip code, we've already talked about the impact of property taxes on schools in a previous class. But if you live in that zip code, the public school has to take you. Charter schools don't have to do that. Charter schools are free to say, no, we don't want this student. They're too high maintenance basically, and so they're more free to reject students from going to school. Alongside this, Trump is also expanding the school voucher system, which will also, allow people to send their kids to charter schools or to private schools. Congressional Republicans are pushing for a universal school voucher system. This plan, combined with the administration's goal to shut down the Department of Education, aims to dismantle public education entirely. The voucher system would divert $5 to $10 billion a year in public funds to private parochial and homeschooling programs. Taxpayers who donate to voucher programs would receive 100% of their money back through tax deductions. This is kind of the way in which they plan to kind of funnel money into this, basically. Wealthy individuals and corporations could donate stocks, avoiding capital gains taxes while gaining dollar for dollar tax deductions. Sarah Poldesky, Director of Advocacy for the School Superintendents Association, called the voucher plan the greatest threat to public education that we've ever had at the federal level. Alongside these ideas to funnel money basically into private schools to dismantle public education, of course, Trump is going after the Department of Education as a whole. Even though something like this should be an overreach of his powers, this has been sanctified by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just recently allowed the Trump administration to preside with mass layoffs at the Department of Education in a 6-3 decision. The ruling overturned a May 22nd decision by a district judge, which had temporarily blocked the layoffs. The unsigned emergency order was issued without argument or explanation, enabling Trump to remove 1,400 workers and accelerate efforts to dismantle the department. The impact on public education. So the Department of Ed oversees programs serving 70 million students and distributes over 120 billion annually in financial aid to 13 million students, more than 100 billion directly to public schools in 2020 to 2021, about 11% of total K-12 funding. This ruling threatens key legislation, including the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The ED enforces critical anti-discrimination policies, including those established by Brown Board of Education, the aforementioned Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Employer v. Doe. These, which protects the right, the latest Supreme Court case protects the rights of undocumented students to attend public education. These protections for minority students with disabilities, English language learners, and immigrants are now under direct attack. Trump has targeted federal grants for sciences, arts, and social studies, billions in cuts. Student aid, a $300 billion cut over the next decade. Universities, new taxes, and draconian loan repayment policies. The goal is to replace broad education with narrow vocational training, funneling youth into low-wage industrial jobs, military service for imperialist wars. So the idea, is to create basically a two-tiered education system. The children of the wealthy can go to well-financed public schools, living in zip codes that most people can't afford to go into, or can afford to send their kids to private schools, while everybody else basically has to send their kids to schools were already underfunded to begin with, which are now even further stripped down and are basically unable to provide any kind of education other than essentially job training to people. Trump is also, of course, going after universities that have been the site of protests. Trump cut $400 million federal funding to Columbia University in retaliation for student-led anti-genocide protests. He also denied student loan forgiveness to teachers and nonprofit workers deemed to harm American values or engage in public disruptions, imposing a political loyalty test. Besides budget cuts, introducing censorship in K-12 education as well. An executive order mandates the teaching of the far-right 1776 report, which censors the history of American imperialism, class struggle, and socialism. Historical significance of public education. A core ideal of the Enlightenment is essential to democracy and a safeguard against authoritarianism. You need people that have, critical thinking skills to resist authoritarianism, which we see, the lack of it playing out, Now, I think of, George Carlin's, comment that, America only wants people smart enough to, work the machines and handle the paperwork. I mean, very, very true. Jefferson's 1779 bill for the general diffusion of knowledge emphasizes education as a foundation of democracy and social rights. The expansion of public education was achieved through mass struggles, including the Civil War, which secured education rights for Black people and poor whites. The fight against child labor and for universal education was central to the American early to the early American labor movement as well. The rise of the CSO in the 1930s, the post-war strike wave, and the civil rights movement significantly advanced public education. By 1955, high school graduation rates reached 80%, and college became widely acceptable to the working class by the 1960s. That's being rolled back now. Ronald Reagan's campaign advisor once wrote, "We are in danger of producing an educated proletariat." So basically, the last thing that the business elites in this country want, the capitalist class in this country wants, and their political servants basically, is an educated workforce. They literally want to dumb people down so that they're more easily controllable, which is kind of what we're getting. Trump and McMahon's call to return education to the states echoes the segregationist states' rights slogans used to oppose school integration, systematic defunding of public education. Now, again, we have to be clear here. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have systematically defunded public education over the past 3 decades. So it's not just the Republicans that you can point the finger at here. Trump followed the blueprint of Bill Clinton, who gutted federal aid programs, and Barack Obama, who slashed Title I and IDA funding as well. Biden allowed the elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund to expire, cutting off $190 billion in aid to struggling school districts, leading to mass layoffs and school closures. Okay, and I'll start to close out here. To the extent that there are any even kind of minimal restriction. Now we're turning to labor issues here, but I'm going to start wrapping things up. All of these things, whether it's public education, whether it's public housing, which is almost non-existent in the United States, affordable, high quality public housing, or even restrictions in the workplace, all these things basically had to be fought for. None of these things were given out. So even things like an 8-hour workday. I mean, that was literally a revolutionary demand well into the 20th century. The Bolshevik leaders like Lenin and Trotsky talked about that. Even in the early 20th century, like I said. So the fact that you work an 8-hour workday rather than a 12-hour workday is because of the struggles of workers in the past, and we see these things are being eroded away. I mean, already the 8-hour workday is kind of being eroded away. Many people are working longer than 8 hours. The fact that you get weekend off, overtime pay, minimum wage, paid vacation, sick days, safety standards, child labor laws. Now, again, I have to add to this though. A lot of these things like paid vacation, sick days are not regulated by law. These are things that, yes, many employers give these things out to employees to be competitive with other employers. But unlike many other countries, these are not sort of like nationally guaranteed things. We know that the minimum wage is woefully inadequate in this country. It's basically not gone up in almost over 15 years now or something like that. So keep all that in mind. The struggle for rights is an ongoing struggle. Frankly, it's not going well. There's not a lot of progress being made. If anything, people are sort of, workers are in a retreat right now as their rights get, steadily eroded away. All right, but I will wrap things up here. And so that's it. Okay, so take care.